Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine 18 Tarot and Books. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. Welcome or welcome back. This is a VR to NiamhWitch, who started the Tarot My Chart tag. I will link to Niamh's video below. Tarot My Chart is an invitation to match a deck to each of our natal planetary placements. So you'll be learning something about my birth chart in this video. I've had quite a bit of fun figuring out a deck for each one. It's quite tricky actually, but it's been a fun kind of exercise to pair up those placements with decks. So I will put timestamps in the description box for the placements, but I will leave the decks as a surprise. Without further ado, the sun. The sun having to do with identity and personality, what energizes us, the bright energy of the sun. My sun is in Pisces. And the deck that I chose to represent Sun in Pisces is the Luminous Void Tarot by Laura Zaspin. And Pisces is a sign that is intuitive. And I think this is a pretty intuitive deck. Pisces is a sign that is, of course, a water sign, and this is a watercolor deck, so there's that kind of very clear correlation, I think. And Pisces is a sign that is imaginative, that tends towards kind of fantasizing, perhaps a bit escapist. And there's something quite fantastical about the figures in this deck. They're quite unusual, a little bit weird, I can relate to that. And this also very specifically, I think, relates to an aspect in my chart, which is that my natal sun squares my ascendant. So having a sun squaring an ascendant, I think, speaks to me not always giving off the impression of being a Pisces, certainly. Me dealing with, I think, some struggles in terms of how I read or how much I share with others, and also, tending to come across not always exactly how I intended. I've been told by some people who are very dear friends that when we first met, they thought that I didn't like them. And I'm going to blame that on my sun ascendant square as a kind of misunderstanding. And this deck, the first time I saw it on YouTube, I'm sure it would have been, I thought that it was fucking weird and I would not be adding it to my collection. And I was totally wrong. Then I got to meet this deck in person at a shop in Toronto where they had copies and they had one open. And I was totally into it. So, not what I thought it was. And so that reminds me of my sun in Pisces, which, its relationship to my ascendant complicates to some extent. Next up is my moon. Moon, of course, having to do with emotions, having to do with instincts, that kind of deep emotional core moon. My moon is in Taurus. Taurus, is steady and stable. And I chose the Fyodor Pavlov tarot to represent my moon in Taurus. I think Taurus is a sign that, finds pleasure in slowing down, enjoying sensory, um, tactile kind of pleasures. This is a beautiful deck to hold. Taurus has a traditional side, I think. And this deck, while being a wonderfully queer deck, has a quite traditional aspect in terms of being, very much a Smith-Waite deck. And the art style, I think, is, it's quite traditional as well. And so this feels like Moon in Taurus to me. I have a friend who, when I told them that my moon was in Taurus, linked that to my emotional core being fucking stubborn. And I don't think that they were wrong. So this deck feels like my moon in Taurus, very much a kind of luxurious and sensorially pleasurable experience, which I think feels moon in Taurus to me, and also, you know, maybe a little bit stubborn in its sticking to quite traditional RWS depictions, we'll say. So I love this deck. I love this deck. That's my moon in Taurus, Fyodor Pavlov. Next up, my ascendant, that ascendant that squares my sun. My ascendant is in Sagittarius. And for my ascendant in Sagittarius, I chose a deck that I have in a Kelly pouch. And that deck is much loved Next World Tarot. Sagittarius is a sign that is adventurous, that is outgoing. It's a sign that loves freedom. It's a sign that's aspirational and idealistic. It's a sign that is associated with philosophy and philosophizing as well. And this deck has a strong philosophy, a strong anarchic philosophy that aligns with my own. The ascendant has a lot to do with outward projection, right? The ascendant having to do with what other people see in you. And the next world, in terms of its, how it appears, this is a deck that, more than most, if not any other in my collection, looks like my community. It's full of people in kind of punk band t-shirts and tattoos and piercings and leg hair and things like this. And so it feels very familiar in that way. And I think that this deck speaks to the kind of philosophical side of Sagittarius, which comes through in my ascendant. I relate more to the kind of philosophical and freedom-loving side of Sagittarius than I do the kind of adventurous aspect, I guess. But this deck feels pretty ascendant in Sagittarius to me. It was one of the easiest choices, I would say. My Mercury. Mercury, the planet of communication, of thought processes, of intellect, of how we learn and learning processes, right? My Mercury, my natal Mercury, is retrograde in Pisces as well. And so for my Mercury in Pisces, I chose another watercolor deck, actually, like my sun in Pisces, or at least partially watercolor deck anyway. It's ink and watercolor, and that's the Architect's Tarot. I really like that this deck, is, I think, very imaginative. It feels fantastical again, like Pisces does. And there's a side, in terms of its kind of style, there's something very kind of precise about it, I think. And the creator, Yusuf Bushiri, being an architect and an architecture PhD student, I think, at the time of creating this, if it's very precise and very linear in some ways, while also being, highly imaginative and unique and pushing all kinds of boundaries of scale and scope. And I can connect this to my Mercury in Pisces, my Mercury retrograde in Pisces. I do think, that this is a connection that makes sense. I think that Mercury in Pisces is a placement that, in terms of kind of how Mercury in Pisces communicates as a planet of communication, communicates kind of sensitively, empathetically, and I can feel that in this deck. this tag leans a little bit towards personifying the decks, which is not a thing I naturally do. So I was a little bit challenged by this tag in that way. But this feels like a very kind of, thinking about Mercury as kind of intellect. It feels like a very flexible thinker, and so that, you know, paired with its again being watercolor and feeling like a fantastical world speaks to me, Mercury in Pisces. Venus. My Venus, planet of love, planet of tastes, planet of pleasure, is in Aquarius. Unconventional, progressive Aquarius. I think of Venus in Aquarius as a very queer placement, and I chose, a deck that I couldn't help but choose for such a queer placement, and that is Terror of the Silicon Dawn by Egypt Urnash. This is a deck that is very unusual. It's a deck that is full of more than you would expect. There's a lot of cards in this deck. Thinking about Venus in Aquarius, I think of, experimenting with relationship structures. I think about, loving in unconventional ways. I think about the ways that this deck goes in quite unconventional directions. And I will say that, Venus and Aquarius, this deck is a little bit kinky in its content and in its guidebook content in ways that really I think that my Venus and Aquarius appreciates. So I feel like, yeah, Terror of the Silicon Dawn for Venus and Aquarius just makes a ton of sense to me. This is also one of the first ones I chose. Like it felt really obvious. Um, I love my Venus and Aquarius. I think that it's probably a fairly obvious one for me. My Mars, planet of the physical, of passion, will, Mars. I chose one of my favorite decks of all time, Naturescapes by Tina, Queen of Wands. My Mars, like my moon, is in Taurus. And I think with two significant planets in Taurus, I can sometimes come off a little bit like a Taurus rather than a Sun Pisces, or rather than a Sagittarius ascendant for that matter. And Taurus, again, I feel like for Mars and Taurus, physical pleasure is a motivator for doing things at times. And I also think that Mars and Taurus, is a placement that doesn't like to rush. Is a placement that likes to stop and smell the roses, if you will. So I use my Mars in Taurus as, the placement in my chart that I blame when I say, like, I don't like rushing, I don't like being hurried, I like to go at my own pace. There's that stubbornness, the initiative and drive of Mars paired with the kind of perseverance and persistence, sometimes stubbornness of Taurus, really going at one's own pace, enjoying the beautiful view. That is what my Mars in Taurus makes me think of. And I think that, this is a deck that I love to just look at. This is a deck that reads really well for me, and so that's, there's some kind of Taurus practicality, I suppose, but this is just so enjoyable to soak in, and that feels Mars and Taurus as well. Next up is perhaps the one that challenged me a little bit, and that is my Jupiter, planet of expansion, of opportunities, of luck, of growth, how our optimism comes through, like all of these things are Jupiter. And my Jupiter is in a sign that I don't really see a ton of in myself, and that's Aries. And for Jupiter in Aries, I chose a Star Trek tarot. Because Aries is a sign that is, one that I think of as being associated with independence. Aries feels enthusiastic, perhaps impatient at times, fiery, bold, a starter, direct. And so I was thinking about, you know, boldly going where no one has gone before feels like Jupiter in Aries to me. Expansion and growing through um, perhaps leadership skills, through asserting oneself, believing in oneself. Definitely, I think um, Aries and Jupiter and Aries, sorry. Jupiter and Aries, I feel like, with the kind of boldness of Aries, can be a bit of a kind of like a risk-taking kind of a placement, spontaneous a little bit. I don't think of myself as a very spontaneous person, but I do think that Jupiter in Aries feels like maybe that and a little bit the Sagittarius is where my spontaneity lives. And my irresponsibility at times. So, boldly going. Jupiter in Aries with the Star Trek tarot makes sense to me. I'm surrounded by decks and running out of places to put them. Okay, Saturn. My Saturn, planet related to boundaries, to structure, to discipline, to how we deal with responsibilities, limits. These are all things that I think of when I think of my Saturn, when I think of Saturn in general. And my Saturn is in Sagittarius as well. So my planet of structure and responsibilities and limits is in a sign that is, oriented towards freedom, is, a sign that sees other possibilities, Sagittarius. And I chose the philosophy cards for this. Be my Saturn in Sagittarius. The philosophy cards is a deck that is based in existentialism. It's not the most fiery deck, visually speaking, though the will suit does have these kind of flames in it. This is the wand suit. And existentialism, I think, is a philosophy that is quite, it's structured in the sense of like existentialism has a clear kind of lines of influence and has a clear kind of vocabulary about it. You can have a syllabus in it, right? But existentialism is also a philosophy that is very strongly concerned with freedom, concerned with human action in the world. And so, in that sense, I think it makes sense to reflect my Saturn in Sagittarius. Now, there's three left. And the three that are left, the further out one gets, the more kind of generational the planets become, right? These are placements that I'm going to be, sharing with so many other people who are born in roughly the same time as me or in the same generation or the same decade and so on as me. So these are placements that feel, less personal in a way, right? My Uranus, for example, is in Sagittarius, which everybody, I think, you know, much of the 80s, much of the 80s and folks born in the 80s have their natal Uranus in Sagittarius. So this is not unique to me by any means. But I chose the Earth Mother Magic Tarot by Aishamira Yashin. Uranus is a planet that has to do with facing uncertainty, has to do with the unexpected. has to do with, creative expression, I think, to some extent. It has to do with, um, major change and upheaval and, um, you know, big shifts, Uranus. And, you know, Uranus being in Sagittarius for me, I think, speaks to, that kind of change making of Uranus in the area of kind of philosophies that has to do with Sagittarius. Creating shifts in thinking feels like Uranus in Sagittarius to me. And this deck, as a utopian feminist deck, feels hopeful and expansive, and like a challenge to the status quo. It feels like it's a challenge to ideas that limit us and a act of disruption to these kinds of ways of thinking. And that feels very Uranus in Sagittarius to me. This is a utopian vision for the future. And I love, love this deck so much. This is a deck that I wish I would have had when I was a young person. Like, of almost any deck in my collection, this is what I would have wished for, as a teenager. Neptune. Neptune also, is in a sign that you could probably guess because it encompasses much of the 80s as well. And 90s for that matter. Neptune in Capricorn. Neptune is, a planet that I associate with spirituality, with imagination, with fantasy. And mine in Capricorn, I associate with the Fifth Spirit Tarot by Charlie Claire Burgess. Capricorn is a sign that I think of as being quite kind of self-controlled and restrained in a sense, pragmatic, practical, tangible, determined, focused on kind of creating tangible changes. And that's what I see in this deck. This is a world that is very familiar. It's not utopia, this deck. This is everyday life, but there's something obviously change making about this kind of representation as well. This is a deck, this is a world that feels very real and very familiar to me that's depicted in this deck. And so I can see Neptune in Capricorn here. And my Neptune in Capricorn makes a nice happy trine with my Mars in Taurus, which I think is interesting. So that's the fifth spirit for Neptune in Capricorn. Finally, Pluto. Had to add Pluto, right? Pluto is a planet. And Pluto is a planet that has to do with big transformations, has to do with power, has to do with beginnings and endings, and how we go through beginnings and endings has to do with control. And like, again, a whole lot of people born in the 80s, my Pluto is in Scorpio and it's retrograde. So I chose the Lubanco Tarot for this placement. Scorpio, is such a, depth and intensity to Scorpio. And this deck to me is depth and intensity. I love this deck. I missed out on this deck when it was in print and then like scored it not that long ago. There's a few copies left over and I was very excited. And actually I wrote down I was reading some different things about astrology before making this video when I was kind of looking at things and for inspiration for what decks to pick. And the Cafe Astrology website said that Pluto in Scorpio is a placement that will call evil for what it is. And that it's a placement that reflects kind of intense feelings about a lot of intense things, intimacy, attachment, and so on. And I feel like this deck is a good one for me for exploring some of that. It is an intense one to work with. And so I think reflects that kind of intensity of Pluto in Scorpio. So that's my birth chart in brief anyway, and the decks that I think most readily came to mind for reflecting each of those placements. Thank you, NiamhWitch, for starting this tag, and I've been enjoying the couple of VRs that I've seen. I hope that there are some more VRs. I haven't made too much content about astrology or about my birth chart. I think of myself as a kind of late beginner, early intermediate when it comes to astrology at this point. And so, I wouldn't feel positioned to make any kind of like educational content about astrology. But I've thought about doing things like my friend Katie, like, a long time ago did, here's my birth chart. What would you assume about me based on my birth chart? I've thought about doing things like that, like more kind of personal associations and things like this. So this has been a really fun tag. I'm glad it came about. And if you have any thoughts, to share about your own birth chart, thoughts about my birth chart, that's a bit weird, but it's fine with me. You can make your comments in the comments below or about any of these decks and what you think of them. I welcome that. So I wish you all well. I'll see you all soon and have a great day. Bye.